I'm blending some of the best stuff that we don't do in the US and showcasing it to the average Spider-Man or Batman reader. When you draw the Batmobile from a manga / Akira standpoint, you can do things with that car that most artists wouldn't think of.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes. Many years ago, before I started reading comic books, a good friend of mine in the Navy, his name was Shazam. He was always trying to get me to read comic books. He would bring in The Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns and some classic comic book stories. And I just wasn't interested. And by the time I was reading comics, I asked him, you want to come on the channel? He said, I don't read comics anymore. I read manga. I found shocking, but it is a trend that's going on. And today he's a man of two worlds, a man of manga and comics. How you doing, Tim?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on again, Wes.
Well, I'm really happy to have you on. We love having Donald Thump and the Bunderdome and Tim Lim all in here in the channel. So American comic sales have essentially flatlined. They were declining there. There was actually a kind of a steep decline one year, but they've just been kind of flat for years now, whereas manga sales in America are like kind of going through the roof. You've been shifting from American comics over to manga. What is it about manga that made them your preferred reading choice now?
Well, to preface this, what put manga on my radar, because growing up, I wasn't one of those kids in the 90s who actually latched on to anime and manga and Toonami and stuff. For the most part, I tried whatever was on, but I just wasn't a fan of it for various reasons. There were some exceptions like Cowboy Bebop, which is kind of like the normie's guide to anime. You kind of start there. I actually didn't even like Dragon Ball Z, for example. So I never liked it. But basically, a couple of factors got me into checking out anime and manga. One is the one that you already pointed out, which is declining comic book sales, but the uptick in manga. And I was just puzzled by that because I just thought, well, maybe it's like a momentary fad or whatever, but they're just incrementally getting bigger and bigger as far as sales go. So it kind of dispels that notion of print is dead. You always hear that from, I guess, cynics and people who are from the comic book industry who just want to sweep away the decline in comic book sales as, oh, print is dying. It's a slow death. Well, manga is going up and up. So a buddy of mine who happens to consume anime and manga kind of regularly, he's the guy who got me into checking it out. And so I think part of the reason why there's such a strong backing for manga and anime and why they're increasing, it's from a multitude of factors. And I think the first one is the storytelling. The storytelling of, let's just take manga, for example. It's very good. It's very honest. And there's a plethora of it where if you want to dive into things that are more adult, you definitely have that. If you want to dive into things that are more, I guess, childlike and friendly, you have that as well. But you don't sacrifice something in the process. I think that's key. Typically, yes, the answer to comics is, well, we have that too. You can have like your black label, but then you can have like the kids section over here. Well, the problem with the kids section for comics is that it does pander to children, and a lot of times the art reflects that. Whereas I think in manga, you can find the same quality of art regardless of the genre that it's in. So you don't sacrifice anything. You're able to kind of have your cake and eat it too. And I'm lumping anime and manga into kind of the same category because in a lot of cases, the two of them are intertwined. Some of them are actually almost like one-to-one perfect translations of each other without much difference in between other than the medium itself. So I think that that's probably the biggest reason for why those sales are continuing to increase.
I know what you're saying. Like, as far as American comics go, Super Sons is more written with children in mind, but the art in it was so phenomenal. I love the comic book, and I like the characterization and everything. But if it just had some of that like Tumblr art on it, it just wouldn't have been nearly as digestible as enjoyable.
Well, let me focus on that real quick, because it was thanks to you guys that I found Super Sons, particularly because someone had described Jorge Jimenez's style as being almost like American manga. So thank you for that recommendation. And yes, you are correct. I think it's obvious that he borrows a lot of influence from manga as far as artistic style is concerned, but he's still able to remain distinctly, I guess, Western in nature. But that's another one of those books where it's very wholesome. It focuses on the two kids, focuses on Damian Wayne and Jonathan Kent. And I think a child could read it, and you could feel confident as a parent letting your child read it without anything in there being too graphic. But it's done in a way that doesn't patronize children. It's done in a way where it's serious storytelling. So I would feel confident letting basically all ages pick it up. And that's the type of thing that you need. But what do? We end up scrapping it so that we can focus more on whatever is tying in with what Brian Michael Bendis has in mind, like aging Jonathan Kent or whatever nonsense is going on. So that's another example of them kind of preemptively shooting themselves in the foot when they have a good thing going, when I think they were on the right track. So yeah, I'm very glad that you mentioned that.
You know, there's a couple of other things I want to talk about that I think might be contributing factors. I think one of them is the price. You know, you get a volume of manga and it's about $6 to $8. Like, they're really thick, and you get a lot of story in there, and you don't get the bang for your buck, with American trades.
Well, and there's a multitude of reasons behind that. It explains it. It might not account for everything, but just a little bit of, I guess, backstory in terms of how manga is made. There's a lot of uncredited artists that go into manga because you have basically a support team to help you out. You have the person who drops in the black ink, kind of like an inker, but basically their job is to fill in like huge swaths of black. And that's on top of whoever your inker is. You have a half toner also who can come in and help with that as well. And that's on top of like what we consider to be the traditional team in Western comics, your colorist, your letterer, and the main artist as well. You have like an uncredited staff that can help with a lot of manga. Manga is a lot longer in terms of you pay $10, you get more pages, but manga is a lot more decompressed in terms of what they devote to their page and their real estate. So in average American comic, you have anywhere between 4 and 6 panels on average, but in manga, it's not unusual to basically have the equivalent of multiple splash pages and to draw out scenes. So it can be kind of deceiving because you're essentially telling the same story. It's just how drawn out you want it to be. But there's still no arguing that for $10, as far as page count is concerned, you definitely get more in manga. Now, manga is also black and white typically. It doesn't have any color in it. It's also printed on newsprint. But it's also the idea that I think manga always looks like it's meant to be read. It doesn't have the feel that it's meant to be collected. It's meant to be shelved, read, and enjoyed, not something to be kind of locked behind a case or to resell for like a higher price. So it's the idea that it ends up having this more kind of I don't want to say disposable because that tends to sound very negative, but it's the idea that it's supposed to be consumed for the reason it's supposed to be, which is to be read. So I think that has a great deal to do with it too. So you're a kid, you have $10, you have to make a choice. Are you going to read this book over here that's colored with X number of pages, whose art quality might not be up to snuff, or do you want to take a chance over here with this manga? And typically the manga that we get here in the States is manga that has already had like a good track record over in Japan of selling like millions of copies. So that amongst that little tiny island nation, that it's already kind of been a hit over there in a localized manner. To think about how big it's going to be when it comes to the States. So in a way, I don't want to say it's a form of gatekeeping, but it's almost like a type of filtering where kind of the cream of the crop rises to the top. And Japan has had a pretty good track record of that in terms of what passes muster as far as their storytelling is concerned. And what passed muster for them is not along ideological lines. As I've mentioned, there's something for everyone. I have a funny story about that regarding like an anime convention. The first anime convention I ever went to was San Japan. And I think it's one of the first cons I've been to where you saw people wearing like Make America Great Again hats running around. And at the same time, you would see people wearing like hentai shirts running around. And it's the idea that no one fights with each other because in this kind of Mos Eisley-esque atmosphere, everyone gets along because there's something for everyone. If you don't agree with someone's politics or their taste or their degeneracy or their wholesomeness, fine. You can find something that suits you, and everyone is just kind of unified in their mutual respect for the craft.
Yeah, it's definitely much more welcoming. There's so many weird things in manga. Like one of the one I've read is the Promised Neverland, and they're going to have some slight spoilers, but it's about some school kids that are basically being raised. They're really smart, and they're basically cattle, but they don't realize it. That is a really crazy concept. I don't think anyone would ever put that into an American comic book because it's really out there, and it certainly wouldn't be a huge bestseller. But you can find stuff like that in manga that and it's a great story. It's just executed well, and the characters all really well realized.
Yeah, and not just that, but it seems like whenever we do have titles that do venture out into different genres, for example, anything that's war related or anything that's a Western. For example, like one of the best books I picked up from DC in recent years, like at least in the decade, was like the Jonah Hex title, which is great. That was Jimmy Palmiotti who did that. But it wasn't heavily promoted. It was not promoted on the same level as like a superhero book. So you kind of have this tiered system where, yes, you do have an introduction of other genres, but in a marketplace where things should be promoted, it's almost as if they kind of left it on its own to do its own thing rather than give it kind of a status that it deserved. So I think in American comics, a lot of them have been so, at least with the big two, a lot of them have been so attached to the superhero genre that it's kind of propelled that narrative or that way of thinking moving forward. Now, whenever you do have other genres, they're typically in the indie scene. But I mean, I'll just be frank, a lot of them are so degenerate in terms of their quality that they're not even marketable to children. You're basically trying to target an audience that's like 30 and older with those titles. But again, I go to Barnes and Noble typically like once a month just to either hang out or see what's on the shelves. And I almost never see the kids in the graphic novel section. They're always the aisle in front of it where the manga is, and there's kids of all ages there as well as adults.
So the last thing I really want to key on that it's not even close. They're blowing their American counterparts out of the water as far as manga goes, and it's digital. The interface, especially with Comixology for digital comics, just absolutely suck. But you get Shonen Jump. It's such a great value. You have so many awesome digital options with manga. How is that happening? How have we not caught up?
I think part of it is a lack of transparency. Like even now, I always have to weigh that digital option. We're doing it this year, as a matter of fact, but already I'm running into a hurdle because people have been telling me, good luck with that, because I've been waiting for 5 months to have my book get on Comixology. I'm like, well, why? It's like, well, because they have like this waiting period, or they have to review your book, and there's no timestamp in terms of how fast or how slow that's going to take. And even the digital sales from like the big two, there's no releasing of how those translate. So we're kind of in this nebulous area where people who want to take the digital leap cannot, because they're scared of piracy. I think that's the big one happening, or maybe they don't want to go through the hassle or the hurdle of doing it. But like you said with Shonen Jump, I think it's the fact that they kind of came prepared and released those on their platform that they're good. And the price that you're paying for that subscription is like unbeatable just for the sheer content you're getting. I mean, heck, just a second ago, we were talking about the $10 price point for most manga and the number of pages. Imagine paying a digital subscription where you can have that times infinity, at least, for how much you can consume in a month. And there you have it. That's just a recipe for success.
Yeah, it's crazy. They've completely outpaced and basically pants the U.S. comic book industry as far as digital goes. It's not even close. I think we've kind of talked about the strengths that manga has and how it's entering the market in the U.S. and competing, and not only competing, in many ways doing much better. I do want to talk about another artist that has heavy manga influences. You're an artist yourself. We got to talk about Sean Gordon Murphy. He's really bringing some of those manga effects and that manga styling and incorporating it into Western, mythology with Batman and stuff. It's just beautiful to look at. Do you see manga having more influence as far as visuals moving forward?
Yeah, and part of it is a tit for tat because, for example, a lot of anime was inspired by Walt Disney movies. So, you look at Studio Ghibli, for example. Miyazaki was inspired by Walt, and one thing that the Japanese have been very good at is kind of reverse engineering or plussing the achievements or the feats of other countries and other inventions and other aesthetics to their liking. And so in return, it's not unusual for us to kind of see what they're doing and maybe modify that to some extent. You mentioned Sean Gordon Murphy, but the one that stands out in my mind because I grew up in the 80s and 90s was Joe Madureira. And Joe Mad was a huge influence on me. You can kind of tell it's a Western artist kind of extrapolating manga elements, but there was no denying it based on like his stylistic choice, the way he draws eyes, the way he draws people with very angular features. He just had a very good command of line weight in a lot of the art that he did. And I see a lot of those same similarities in what Sean Gordon Murphy is doing. In fact, he has a distinct style in which he uses kind of like these thin line brushes to create very angular features. Like his Joker and his Batman are very distinct. They have very chiseled jaws. In the case of the Joker, he has a very pointy chin and very pointy nose. And these kind of artistic liberties are what makes him such a distinct artist. But he's able to kind of influence it with his own distinct craftsmanship. And in the case of Sean Gordon Murphy, he's definitely kind of a car enthusiast, so his cars are always meticulously detailed. I detect a certain diesel punk feel to a lot of his works, and I would actually kind of elevate him as being a very good example of kind of taking, we talk all the time about the greatness of the manga art, but I would actually point to Sean Gordon Murphy as an example of a Western artist who is perhaps influencing others who are not from the U.S. based on his strengths as an American artist, borrowing from manga influences, of course, but distinctly Western. But he's fantastic. He and Joe Mad, I can definitely see the influence there. And as we mentioned, Jorge Jimenez as well.
Yeah, it's so cool some of the things that he's able to do with his car chase scenes and the way he puts things into motion. You're right on the edges, and it's distinctly Sean Gordon Murphy, but it's also distinctly manga influenced. I just love it. I hope more American artists start incorporating that in. It's such a cool look.
I love his art, and one thing I tried doing, actually, if you look carefully, I actually do it in the Soul Finder book with Douglas Ernst, but I actually did his fingerprinting technique. So I actually created a fingerprint brush based on like my own thumbprint and started applying that because I love that. There's something about his work. I'm a big fan of art that looks like it was handcrafted. You can actually see the craftsmanship. You can tell that human hands touched it. And I think that, no pun intended, he's literally putting his own touch to his work by doing the whole fingerprint thing. But I think it works to try and create like gritty atmosphere. So there are key panels in Soul Finder where I did the same thing, obviously not to the same effect because I'm not Sean Gordon Murphy, but it definitely has had an influence in terms of what I've experimented on as well.
Tim, I just want to say thank you very much for joining me today. Manga is kind of blowing up in the U.S. I'm starting to enjoy it myself. Definitely not as much as you are. Is there one last thing you would like to say before we wrap this up?
Yeah, if you want, we can kind of give our recommendations in terms of things that we're reading. I would encourage you, if you're listening to this and you're a Western comics fan, you like comic books, and you want to see what all the hype is about, my number one recommendation is not the one that you're thinking. You might be thinking it's My Hero Academia, but it's not. I'll give you my gateway drug into manga. It was actually One Punch Man. I think One Punch Man, if you're like an older adult, like in your late 20s and older, I think that you would enjoy it more. They cover a lot of the same themes, but One Punch Man is almost like it kind of defeats this idea of, well, you can't write Superman because he's a boring character. Because what do you do with a character who's like pretty much all powerful? Well, you come up with something like One Punch Man, which is very clever in terms of how they basically write around a character who can defeat everything with one punch. But that's just an example. Obviously, My Hero Academia has been highlighted and touted with obviously due respect as evidence that the Japanese creators have kind of shown the way in terms of making the genre more pertinent by kind of beating us at our own game. But there's so many other titles that you can pick up depending on the genre that you're interested in. But because we're talking comics and the intersection of that and manga, those are the two that I would just point out for people who are interested in dipping their toes.
I completely agree on One Punch Man. I think that is a great introduction. I love that. That's one of the ones that I did. If you need something that's a character you recognize, I would say Battle Angel Alita or I would say that one's a great one. You know, my wife reads that one. I peek over her shoulder. It's an excellent book. And also, if you want something just really weird but compelling, The Promised Neverland. It's awesome.
There you go. And I might have to check that one out because that's one I have not picked up or seen yet.
Yeah, it's different. All right, Tim. Thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it. And I can't wait till we have you on the channel next time and talk something else.
Absolutely. It's always my pleasure. And I can't wait to be on Thinking Critical again.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I would appreciate it very much. It helps us attract more views for the channel. Subscribe for future commentary, comic book news, and reviews. And don't forget to ring the bell for notifications. If you want to talk comics, movies, and much, much more, you can follow me on Twitter at Wes_from_TC. With that, Salamat Po, and I'm out.